3 days. That is all it took. 3 days in Beijing. And the man who stepped off the plane in Palm Beach was no longer the man who boarded the plane at Joint Base Andrews Air Force Base. The Boeing 757-200, painted gold with the words Trump Force One running down its fuselage, touched down slowly on the runway. Camera flashes lit up the Florida night like a lightning storm that never ended. Dozens of satellite trucks, hundreds of journalists, the entire international press corps holding its breath. Because everyone watching understood one thing: something had happened inside China, something that had not been announced. Something that had not been negotiated through any of the normal diplomatic channels. Not the State Department, not the National Security Council. Not a single allied foreign ministry had been consulted. And now the plane had landed, and the world was about to find out what it was. The door of Air Force One opened. Donald Trump appeared at the top of the stairs. Red tie. Signature wave. Two fists pumped toward the crowd like a boxer who had just won the title. He descended slowly. He took his time. Because Donald Trump always takes his time when he knows the cameras are watching. And then he stepped to the microphone and said 3 phrases that immediately set off alarms in every allied capital from Ottawa to Berlin to Tokyo. Historic trip. Historic deal. A great victory for America. That was it. No details. No specifics. No joint statement from the Chinese side. No readout from the State Department. Just 3 phrases and a smile. And in that smile, every allied intelligence service in the Western world read the same message. We don't know what was agreed. And that is the most dangerous thing we have ever not known. But then a journalist in the back of the crowd raised her hand. 1 question. 7 words. Will America still defend Taiwan militarily? The crowd went quiet. Trump stopped. The smile, that permanent performed smile, disappeared from his face for the first time in 3 days. He looked at the reporter for a long moment, and then he said the sentence that would fracture the Western alliance more completely than any tariff, any trade war, any diplomatic incident of the past 4 years. I don't like answering questions that give away America's negotiating advantage. Pause. In the new world, everything is negotiable. The room fell silent. Not the silence of agreement. Not the silence of respect. The silence of people who had just heard something so consequential, so irreversible, that the normal machinery of diplomatic response could not process it fast enough. Everything is negotiable. 3 words. And in those 3 words, the entire architecture of the post-World War II Western alliance, every security guarantee, every mutual defense treaty, every Article 5 commitment that had held Europe together for 75 years began to shake. To understand what those 3 words actually meant, you need to understand what had been signed inside Beijing. Because this was not just a trade visit. What the cameras captured on the runway in Florida was the visible surface of an agreement that went far deeper than Boeing contracts and tariff schedules. Here is what the intelligence briefings circulating in allied capitals said had been agreed. China would purchase additional Boeing aircraft, a visible, photogenic win that Trump could show his domestic audience immediately. Washington would ease a portion of the technology restrictions that had been choking Chinese semiconductor companies, a quiet concession that Beijing had been demanding for 2 years. A number of tariff increases would be frozen temporarily, creating the appearance of a trade truce without resolving any of the underlying structural disputes. American stock markets surged. The Dow Jones jumped. Headlines in the United States declared a breakthrough. And on the surface, if you only read the American business press that morning, it looked like a genuine diplomatic triumph. But here is what the American press did not report. And here is what the Allied intelligence services were reading with quiet, building horror. The technology concessions Washington had granted to Beijing were not ordinary trade accommodations. They touched semiconductor manufacturing equipment. They touched artificial intelligence infrastructure. They touched the precise categories of technology that America's own National Security Council had classified as critical to Western military superiority. The tariff freeze applied asymmetrically, in ways that redirected supply chains away from European manufacturers and toward Chinese alternatives. And the Boeing deal, the visible, celebrated centerpiece of the trip, was structured in a way that directly displaced orders that had been scheduled for Airbus, Europe's flagship aviation manufacturer. Every element of the agreement had been designed to produce an American win that simultaneously created a European loss, and not one European government had been told it was coming, not consulted, not informed, not even given a courtesy notification before the cameras were rolling. That was the deal. And now, standing at a microphone in Florida, the President of the United States was telling the world that in this new era, everything is negotiable, including, apparently, the security of America's closest allies. At the European Union headquarters in Brussels, the emergency meeting began before Trump's motorcade had reached Mar-a-Lago. The lights in the main council chamber burned through the night. A French diplomat slammed his hand on the table so hard that the water glasses rattled. If Washington and Beijing are genuinely aligning their economic interests, he paused, then the European Union will be crushed between them. No one disagreed. because the mathematics were brutal and immediate. Germany's electric vehicle industry, the crown jewel of the German industrial economy, the sector that employed more German workers than any other, had been built on the assumption that China would remain a competitor, but not a preferential American partner. The moment Washington began easing technology restrictions toward Beijing while maintaining tariff pressure on European goods, German automakers faced a structural disadvantage they had not seen coming and had no immediate answer for. France had a more specific and immediate problem: Airbus. The Boeing deal signed in Beijing was not just a commercial transaction, it was a strategic signal. If Beijing was now buying Boeing, at preferential terms, as part of a diplomatic package, then Airbus was not merely losing market share. Airbus was being deliberately excluded from the world's fastest-growing aviation market, as a consequence of European governments refusing to align themselves fully with Washington's transactional foreign policy. France had not agreed to Washington's transactional foreign policy. France had not been asked, and now France was paying the price. Poland had the most existential concern of all. A Polish general said quietly, in a closed session that 3 diplomatic sources later described to journalists, "If Washington can negotiate about Taiwan without consulting NATO, one day Washington can negotiate about Eastern Europe." The room went silent. No one refuted it, because everyone in that room was thinking it. The logic was simple and terrible. The American commitment to European security had always rested on a foundational assumption that the United States viewed that commitment as a matter of shared values, not transactional interest. That defending Poland, defending the Baltic states, defending Germany, these were obligations that America honored because they reflected what America believed, not merely what America calculated. But the Beijing summit had cracked that foundation. If Taiwan, a democracy, a semiconductor powerhouse, a symbol of the very liberal international order that NATO existed to protect, could be placed on a negotiating table without consultation, without warning, without so much as a phone call to allied foreign ministries, then nothing was guaranteed. Then everything was, as the president had said himself, negotiable. The word echoed through the corridors of Brussels all night. Negotiable. In a room at the top of the Canadian government building in Ottawa, the lights were still on. Mark Carney stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the Ottawa River in the darkness. He had been watching the Florida press conference live. He had heard the words, "Everything is negotiable." Behind him his cabinet had gathered. No one spoke. The silence in the room had the quality of a room where everyone has just understood something simultaneously. Something that cannot be unsaid, cannot be unheard, cannot be walked back. An aide placed a classified briefing document on the table. It had come from Brussels, through diplomatic channels within the hour. The title was a single sentence: EU is preparing for the post-American trust era. Carney did not turn around immediately. He kept his eyes on the river. He had spent his entire professional life at Goldman Sachs, at the Bank of Canada, at the Bank of England, in rooms where the most dangerous words were the ones that sounded reasonable. The most dangerous negotiations were the ones where one side believed it was winning while the other side was quietly rearranging the board. He had watched Trump perform confidence on that runway in Florida. He had heard the historic deal language. He had noted, with the precision of a man who had once regulated the global financial system, exactly what had not been said. No allied consultation. No G7 notification. No NATO readout. No framework for how these agreements would interact with existing treaty obligations. Just a great victory for America. Carney finally turned from the window. He looked at his ministers. "Is he pressuring China?" one minister asked. Carney shook his head slowly. "No." He paused. "He is pressuring everyone." The room understood. Because what Trump had done in Beijing was not bilateral diplomacy. It was a restructuring of the global order conducted unilaterally, announced triumphantly, and designed to leave every other player scrambling to understand their new position in a world where the old rules no longer applied. And Canada's position in that new world was not comfortable. A briefing officer pulled up a chart on the large screen at the end of the room. The number on the screen was stark: 80%. 80% of Canadian exports depended, directly or indirectly, on access to the American market. Oil, automobiles, rare minerals, lumber, agriculture. The entire architecture of the Canadian economy had been built, over decades, on the assumption that the American market was permanently open, governed by shared rules, mutual interest, and the implicit guarantee of allied solidarity. That assumption had just been placed on a negotiating table in Beijing, without Canadian consent, without Canadian knowledge, without a single phone call. A national security advisor spoke first. "What frightens Europe is not that Trump negotiated with China. It is how he did it. No NATO consultation. No G7 notification. No allied briefing. Just transactions." The room absorbed this, because the distinction mattered enormously. A world where America negotiated aggressively but within the system of allied consultation was a world Canada could navigate. A world where America negotiated entirely according to transactional logic where relationships were not partnerships but leverage, where alliances were not commitments but bargaining chips. That was a different world entirely, and Canada had just been shown with uncomfortable clarity which world it now lived in. 2 days later, Trump was at a rally in a swing state. He had been talking about the economy, about jobs, about the return of American greatness, and then, without transition, without setup, without any apparent logical connection to what he had been saying, he turned to Canada. We protect Canada for decades. The crowd stirred. We spend billions on NATO. Growing noise from the audience. And what do we get in return? He let the question hang. The crowd began to respond. Chants, booing, the familiar theater of a Trump rally finding its rhythm. Trump smiled, but it was the cold smile, the one that preceded the attack. Canada likes to make money off America, but they want to lecture us about democracy. Laughter, cheering. He paused again. He looked at the crowd, and then he delivered the line that sent the Canadian dollar into immediate freefall and set the Toronto Stock Exchange on fire. If Canada thinks they can survive without the American market, let's find out what happens. Within minutes, the Canadian dollar dropped. International wire services ran the headlines simultaneously across 40 countries. Trump publicly pressures Canada following secret deal with China. The markets read the subtext immediately. This was not rhetoric. This was positioning. Trump had just returned from Beijing with a deal that restructured North American supply chains in ways that disadvantaged Canada. And now on a rally stage, he was signaling that Canada's access to the American market, the 80% dependency that sat on that chart in Carney's cabinet room, was not a given. It was leverage, and he was willing to use it. That night, Mark Carney appeared on national Canadian television. No music, no elaborate staging, no speechwriter's fanfare, just a desk, a chair, the Canadian flag behind him, and a man who had spent 30 years in the highest levels of the global financial system looking directly into a camera. He spoke quietly, not because he lacked confidence, but because the quietest voices in the room are always the ones who know exactly what they are about to say. There are moments in history, he paused, when every nation must decide whether it is a sovereign country or simply an extension of someone else's empire. Canada went silent. Every television, every phone screen, every news feed in the country showing the same image, this calm, measured man with the economist's precision and the statesman's timing, saying the words that no Canadian prime minister had ever needed to say before. He continued, Canada will not choose fear. We will not allow our economy to be used as a political pressure tool, and we will not trade our sovereignty for temporary comfort. He did not raise his voice once. He did not attack Trump by name. He did not perform outrage. He simply stated, with the quiet authority of someone who had once regulated the global financial system and knew exactly what leverage meant and exactly how to neutralize it, Canada is not for sale. Canada is not negotiable, and Canada will not behave as though it is. His approval rating jumped overnight, and in Washington something shifted, because this was not the Canada they had calculated. The Canada in their strategic models was a dependent economy with 80% exposure to the American market, a country that would absorb pressure, make quiet concessions, and ultimately align itself with whatever Washington decided. That Canada had just been replaced by something else, something that looked directly into a camera, something that said the word sovereignty without flinching, something that did not blink. The next 48 hours inside the Canadian government were the most consequential in a generation. Carney convened a series of meetings that his staff later described, quietly, as the moment Canada stopped being reactive and started being strategic. The analysis on the table was brutal in its clarity. If Trump had returned from Beijing with an arrangement that restructured North American trade flows to disadvantage Canada, and if he was now willing to publicly threaten Canadian market access on a rally stage, then the 80% dependency was not just an economic vulnerability. It was a weapon pointed at Canada's head. And the only answer to a weapon pointed at your head is not to argue about whether it's loaded. The answer is to move out of the line of fire. Carney began by identifying what Canada actually possessed that the world wanted, and that could not simply be replaced by American or Chinese alternatives. The list was longer than most people realized. Rare minerals, the world's transition to clean energy, electric vehicles, solar panels, wind turbines, battery storage, required specific minerals that Canada held in extraordinary abundance. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, the materials that every advanced economy on Earth needed to build the next century's industrial base. Agricultural capacity. Canada fed significant portions of the world. That dependency ran in multiple directions and could be redirected. Energy, oil, natural gas and hydroelectric power that half a continent depended on. And perhaps most importantly, a trusted regulatory environment, a stable legal system, and a track record of honoring agreements, the very things that the Beijing summit had just demonstrated Washington could no longer be counted on to provide. These were not weaknesses. These were assets. And Carney began, quietly and with the methodical precision of someone who had restructured the global financial regulatory framework after 2008, to build a strategy around them. New trade negotiations opened with Japan and South Korea. Australia was called about a coordinated approach to rare mineral supply chains that bypassed both Chinese processing and American political uncertainty. The conversations with Brussels became more substantive, more specific, more urgent. And in every conversation, Carney said the same thing. We are not abandoning the American alliance. We are building something that makes the alliance optional rather than existential. The distinction mattered, because a Canada that needed America to survive would always yield to American pressure. But a Canada that had built alternative partnerships, that had diversified its dependencies, that had made itself essential to multiple global supply chains rather than captive to one, that Canada had options. Options meant leverage, and leverage meant that the next time Trump stood at a rally and said, "Let's find out what happens if Canada loses American market access," Canada's answer would not be fear. Canada's answer would be, "We already built for that scenario." Would you like to see the numbers? Something extraordinary was happening simultaneously in Brussels, Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, Seoul, and Canberra. Not a formal alliance, not a treaty, not an institution with a headquarters and a charter and a secretary general. Something more organic, more durable, more consequential. A recognition, a shared recognition, arrived at independently, in different capitals, in different languages, by different governments with different histories and different interests, that the world had changed in a way that required a new kind of response. The phrase that began appearing in every strategic document, every think tank report, every closed diplomatic session, was the same: the third pole. Not Washington, not Beijing, something in between, and something genuinely different from both. A block of mid-sized democracies that shared, despite their differences, three foundational commitments: rules-based trade, the belief that commerce should operate according to transparent, enforceable, predictable rules, not according to the transactional preferences of whichever superpower happened to hold the most leverage on any given Tuesday. Democratic governance, the commitment to accountable institutions, free elections, independent judiciaries, and the protection of individual rights, not as Western cultural preferences, but as universal foundations for stable, trustworthy partnerships. Strategic autonomy, the recognition that no democratic nation could afford to be so completely dependent on any single partner, American or Chinese, that its fundamental decisions were constrained by someone else's leverage. The countries that began coalescing around this framework were not natural allies in the traditional sense. The European Union and Japan had deep historical complexities. Canada and Australia had spent decades operating comfortably inside the American security umbrella. South Korea's relationship with China was economically interwoven in ways that made clean alignment difficult. But they had all just watched the same press conference in Florida. They had all heard the same three words: everything is negotiable. And they had all understood, with different details and different timelines, but the same fundamental recognition, that a world where America operated on pure transactional logic was a world where being a small or medium-sized democracy was genuinely dangerous. Because in a purely transactional world, you are only safe if you have something the powerful want, and only for as long as they want it. The new framework that emerged had a different logic. In a world of the third pole, you are safe because you are part of a network of relationships that no single actor can afford to destabilize, because destabilizing it would harm everyone inside it, including the actor attempting destabilization. It was the logic of mutual interdependence. It was the logic that had actually kept the peace for 75 years. Not American military power alone, but the network of mutual economic interests and shared institutions that made war genuinely costly for everyone. And now, as Washington abandoned that logic for the simpler arithmetic of transaction and leverage, the remaining democracies were quietly, urgently rebuilding it among themselves. France proposed a European defense capability genuinely independent of NATO command structures, not to replace NATO, but to ensure that European security did not depend entirely on a Washington that had just demonstrated it could make major strategic decisions without consulting Paris. Germany approved a defense budget at levels not seen since the Cold War. Canada opened formal trade talks with Japan, South Korea, and the Gulf states simultaneously, building the alternative market access that would eventually make the 80% American dependency a historical artifact rather than a current vulnerability. Australia began coordinating with Canada and Japan on rare mineral supply chains that could meet the world's clean energy transition needs without routing through either American political uncertainty or Chinese processing dominance. And in every capital, in every meeting, a new phrase began appearing in the briefing documents: strategic autonomy, economic sovereignty, friendshoring, de-risking. These were not anti-American concepts. They were post-dependency concepts. The recognition that the most stable foundation for a democratic nation's security was not a single powerful patron, however reliable that patron had seemed in previous decades, but a diversified network of relationships that made any one partner's defection survivable. The press called it a geopolitical divorce from Washington. But that was not quite right. It was something more nuanced. It was a renegotiation. The democracies of the world telling Washington, "We value this relationship, we want to continue it, but we can no longer afford to build our entire security architecture on the assumption that you will always behave predictably. So we are building something alongside it. And if you want to remain relevant to us, you will need to earn that relevance, not assume it." At the NATO headquarters in Brussels, the final emergency session of that week concluded just before dawn. The Baltic states were frightened. Poland was angry. France was resolute. Germany was recalculating everything. A German diplomat said in the closed session in words that 3 sources later confirmed to journalists, "If Washington can put Taiwan on a negotiating table without consulting us, then one day Washington can put Eastern Europe on the same table." No one in the room refuted it, because everyone in the room had spent the last 72 hours thinking exactly that. And as the session ended, as the delegates filed out into the gray Brussels morning, a European journalist caught one of them on camera, a mid-level diplomat who had been in rooms like this for 20 years, and asked him what had changed. He thought for a moment, then he said something that would be quoted in strategic journals for the next decade. "When 2 elephants fight, the grass gets crushed." He paused. "And when 2 elephants decide to cooperate instead, the grass still gets crushed." The nations in the middle are learning, finally, to stand on their own legs. Step back. Look at the full picture. What had actually happened in the weeks since that Boeing 757 landed in Florida? Donald Trump had returned from Beijing believing he had secured a great victory, and in the narrow, immediate, transactional sense he had. Stock markets rose, headlines celebrated, Boeing got contracts, tariff schedules were adjusted. But here is what the transaction actually cost. Every time Washington acts without consulting its allies, it produces the same result. It teaches those allies that they cannot rely on consultation, and therefore they must build structures that do not require it. The third pole was not a reaction to Trump's personality. It was a reaction to Trump's logic. The logic that said every relationship is a transaction, every alliance is leverage, and every commitment is conditional on whether it continues to serve American interests as calculated by one man's instincts. That logic had a predictable consequence. The countries that had built their security on the opposite logic, on the idea that some things were not negotiable, that some commitments were unconditional, that some partnerships were more than transactions, those countries looked at the Florida press conference and understood that the foundation had shifted beneath them, and they began building a new foundation. Carney understood this before anyone else in the Western democratic world articulated it publicly. He had spent his career in the architecture of global finance, understanding not just what the numbers said, but what the structures meant, and what happened when those structures changed. He understood that 80% dependency was not just an economic statistic. It was a vulnerability that had now been activated. And he understood that the answer was not confrontation with Washington, which would simply accelerate the leverage dynamic, but diversification, strategic patience, and the quiet construction of alternatives that would eventually make the dependency survivable. He said it himself, in a briefing to his cabinet. "The most dangerous relationship is one where the other party knows you have no alternative. Our job is to build the alternatives, not loudly, not provocatively, but permanently." This is the story of how a press conference in Florida, a cold smile at a microphone, and 3 words, "Everything is negotiable," began the reconstruction of the Western world's strategic architecture. Not through confrontation, not through war, not through dramatic rupture, but through the quiet, patient, methodical construction of a third pole, a network of democracies that had finally, after 75 years of comfortable dependency, decided to stand on their own legs. The deal that Trump made in Beijing may have moved markets for a week. The response it triggered may reshape alliances for a generation. Epilogue. The silence and what it meant in Ottawa. After the cabinet session ended, Mark Carney stood alone at the window again. The Ottawa River caught the first light of morning. On the screen behind him, Trump's words still played in a loop on the international newsfeed. "In the new world, everything is negotiable." Carney had spent his entire professional life understanding what words meant when spoken by the most powerful actors in the global system. He understood what these words meant, not as a threat, not as bluster, as architecture. Trump was not making a statement about Taiwan or Canada or trade policy. Trump was making a statement about what kind of world America intended to build. A world without fixed commitments, a world without unconditional alliances, a world where every relationship was repriced daily according to current transactional value. And in that world, Carney understood, the only security was the security you built for yourself, not the security you borrowed from a patron whose word was, by presidential announcement, no longer unconditional. He turned away from the window. He walked back to his desk. He picked up the phone and placed the first of what would become dozens of calls to Tokyo, to Berlin, to Seoul, to Canberra, to Brussels, that would, over the following months, begin to build the architecture of something new. Not an alliance against America, not an alignment with China, something the world had not seen before. A coalition of democracies that had decided, quietly and without drama, that their sovereignty was not negotiable, that their values were not for sale, that their futures were not dependent on any single patron's goodwill. The construction cranes of the New World Order had begun to move, and the man in Ottawa, calm, precise, patient, was already reading the blueprints.